Welcome to another episode of Compassionate Coexistence, a podcast to help you cultivate connection and honor Earth. I'm Lex Sylvie, your fellow traveler on this journey toward hope, healing, and harmony for all beings. Today we have an episode regarding the project's pillar of honoring the rights of all beings. Before we dive in, I have a couple questions for you. Do you consider yourself an animal lover? Does being around animals spark a unique flame of joy in your heart? Have you sought out opportunities to see or interact with animals? Or do you have special memories of visiting with animals of different kinds when growing up? If you answered yes to any of those questions, here are a couple of really important follow-up questions. Can you be 100% sure that the promoted reality that you saw on the surface for those animals authentically mirrored the quality of their lives behind the scenes? Do you know how to discern between true animal sanctuaries and those that boldly claim to be quote-unquote sanctuaries, but which instead are putting profit over the animal's welfare? What attractions with animals promote on their websites and social media isn't always the full picture, and visiting these places can confine the animals we love to lives filled with excruciating misery. So our guide today is Jessica Harris, the Farmed Animals Program Director of the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, or GFAS, which is the only global accreditation organization for true sanctuaries that put animals first. She's here to talk with us today about the red flags that will clue you into staying away from venues that exploit animals, what criteria GFAS uses to verify a true sanctuary, and how you can find and support a true sanctuary near you, for both your own happiness and that of the animals. Jessica has over 15 years' experience in the animal welfare, advocacy, and veterinary fields and holds a bachelor's from North Carolina State University and a master's in animals and public policy from Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. Jessica, thank you so much for being here with us today. You could start by just telling me a little bit about your story. Like, why do you love animals so much? Like, when did that connection start for you?
Yeah, so some of this is going to be probably a little common or stereotypical, but I grew up always having an affinity for animals. I had a cat growing up. I think most of my family were animal lovers, but didn't have a whole lot of other exposure to animals or animal issues until I was in middle school, and we went to our local county shelter down in North Carolina, so Southeast United States, to adopt a dog. And I was 12, but that experience really stood out to me, because at that point in time, and probably still to this day to some extent, municipal shelters in that region are absolutely overrun with homeless animals. And this was probably before spay neuter efforts had time to really show their effects. And this was well before the no-kill movement really took root. And so I think that experience really stuck with me, and something about the conditions for those animals. And there was nothing really wrong. There's nothing horrific about, they had decent care, but the volume and the loud cages, I mean, all of it just stuck with me as a kid. And so as soon as I was old enough to volunteer, I signed up. And so that's kind of where I started, was as a teenager, volunteering at my local municipal shelter. And over time, I started actually working as staff there, and had more time to see things that I thought, I'm not okay with this. I don't like this. I think something needs to change. And I really had some connection to homeless animals or animals in need. Something about that underdog, like wanting to help the helpless, that really resonated with me. Um, so that's what really like took hold for me. And I had a real interest in animal welfare issues from that time. It probably wasn't until I got to college where I first thought I wanted to be a vet. And I've spent a lot of time professionally in the veterinary field as a vet tech. Um, but I, for different reasons, decided not to go to vet school. I think there's always been part of me that has seen the veterinary profession as one way that I can very directly help animals and gained some expertise to do that. And it's been really invaluable. Um, and so I've been a vet tech. I was for about 12 years in kind of different settings, from everything from shelter medicine to emergency medicine to surgery to private general practice. Like, I've done a little bit of everything. But as that was happening in college, I really got interested in farm animal welfare issues. And I think it's a time period where, like, a lot of people do, because they have some freedom to explore their own ethics and where they land. And I started reading all of those classics that I think get a lot of people into animal issues. I read Animal Liberation. Um, I read Gene Bauer's Farm Sanctuary. I read Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, and so many that really, like, catalyzed that process. So I went vegetarian at Thanksgiving during college, which was like a really hard time to just drop that bomb on my family, like, not going to eat all this stuff, but eventually went vegan. And long story short, farm animals, once I really understood what faced them and accepted, took me a little while for it all to sink in and percolate. And once it did, I thought, this is what I need to pay attention to. And so I made my way to sanctuary work because it was sort of a melding of my worlds between sheltering and direct care, um, and all of those welfare and ethics issues that I thought were really important too.
I think it's interesting how those early experiences really do make an impact, and you don't necessarily realize when you're in it, but that the seed is being planted for like a lifelong commitment to trying to build this better world. And now you're at the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, which we'll probably refer to as GFAS throughout the podcast because it's a mouthful.
Yes.
But they're doing really important work, and you're doing really important work. And can you maybe just give like a quick overview of like what is GFAS, when it originated? There was really no regulation of the word sanctuary, and there's still really not. So can you maybe just explain some of those background issues and why GFAS is committed to making a better world through animals through this rigorous framework that they have?
Sure. So I mean, you're very right that the term sanctuary is very loosely thrown around, but GFAS was founded in 2007 by a number of kind of core animal welfare leaders from different leading organizations. I should say animal advocacy organizations, who often would be involved in rescue and animal cruelty work. And they would confiscate animals. They would pull them out of some horrific situation. And we can talk about what those can look like. But they then found themselves at a loss for where to place those rescued animals that had been pulled out, to ensure that they were going to be well cared for and not be back in a new situation where they were being exploited or put at risk. And they quickly realized that it was very hard to identify
Mm.
who those were, because there is, no regulation of the term sanctuary. So there's certainly a number of places out there that use that term because it's sort of a feel-good term, but they really are roadside zoos or petting zoos, or what we'd call like a pseudo sanctuary. So, they're co-opting that term, but still exploiting animals. And so we really quickly realized that there needed to be some set of standards for what constitutes a real, true sanctuary. And so the wildlife program was our first. You can imagine that those are high stakes rescues and confiscations. Are often dangerous animals like big cats or bears or primates. And that was quickly followed by our equine program, which is now our largest program. And now we have a distinct farm sanctuary program, which I direct and is my space. But I get to work with all of these guys, and so there's all different issues that face the different programs, but we really consider any organization that is caring for rescued animals either for their lifetime, or there are a number that, particularly when we're talking about equine or farm, who may adopt animals back out or place them in foster care. Some wildlife organizations also do rehab and release work, and we would still consider them within that sanctuary framework.
What are some of these like the claims that they're making of, oh yeah, we're a sanctuary? Some of that I've seen are like, we're doing this for conservation, we're doing this for everything's on the animal's own terms, and then you read about it in the news, crackdowns and animals confiscated and animals dying. Like, what kind of situations, or maybe just go through some red flags?
So I think conceptually, if I wanted to summarize the core difference or the core thing that would set these apart, is that true sanctuaries, the animals come first. The animals come before profit, before visitor experience, before ease for staff, visitors, anybody else. Anytime that we introduce paid opportunities to interact with animals, guaranteed interactions, particularly with wildlife, and to some extent other species. These are very problematic. And so we'll talk about kind of some of the core features of what we consider a true sanctuary that would quickly allow you to pick out places that have issues. But the core of it is that animals should not be exploited. Their well-being comes before everything else. And oftentimes what we will find, and this probably exists on a spectrum, in terms of how intentional the exploitation or neglect or whatever it is may be. We certainly will see places that are intentionally misusing the term sanctuary to attract folks to come there, and are intentionally doing programs that or activities that will exploit the animals. And then there's kind of the other end of the spectrum where there's well-meaning, well-intentioned sanctuaries that just aren't executing what we would like to see. But I think we talk about sort of the root causes of sanctuary a lot, as far as why animals end up coming to sanctuary, like where are they all coming from? And of course, there's so much variation by species. If we're talking about wildlife, lots of them can come from zoo closures. Lots of them can come from private ownership that's inappropriate. Like, we shouldn't be keeping big cats and primates as pets. For so many reasons. When we talk about, equines, oftentimes it's either neglect cases in which law enforcement is involved. Sometimes it's owners who can no longer care for their horse for whatever reason. And when it comes to farm animals, it's just animal agriculture. So sometimes animals are lucky enough to escape, fall off a transport truck, escape a slaughterhouse. Ironically, that might be the best day of their life if they happen to land at a sanctuary as a result. Other times it's people who went online and wanted a teacup pig and didn't realize that teacup pig could be 200, 300 pounds, and they're not allowed to have it in their neighborhood. And now where does that piggy go? So there's just so many avenues for animals coming in, and we've heard all kinds of certainly horror stories about their origins.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for explaining that. And I know that a lot of people listening to this might consider themselves animal lovers, and this has been newly on my radar just when you say that you love animals, but then you're contributing to their exploitation. Like, I do believe that people are generally good and that we are wired for empathy. And I don't think that most people who go to these exploitative venues like go with the intention that I'm going to exploit animals today. I think there's just a lack of understanding that what you're seeing on the surface might be very different from what the animals' lives are like behind the scenes. And I know when I first started learning about this, it was almost overwhelming because some of these venues are so ingrained in our culture. Kids go on field trips to zoos or aquariums or, sometimes farms where animals are later slaughtered, and this is not presented to children. This isn't presented to parents. Can you please walk us through just some of the criteria that GFAS uses to know, like, this is an actual sanctuary for animals? Because you can't always take claims um at face value, like, yeah, we treat our animals well and they're our priority. And then, most people aren't sitting at their computers reading USDA reports like before they go to these places.
One thing that really sets apart true sanctuaries from other captive animal organizations is, aside from this concept of putting the animals first in terms of all of your programming and your care, it's really focusing on their species specific needs, whether that's for space. Um, so, for example, I think it's all over the media right now, certain elephants that have been in zoos for a long time. And there's increasing consensus that it is just not possible to provide those animals um, a high quality of life because of the restrictions of captivity in that setting. Um, True sanctuaries have very expansive enclosures for species like that, and they will accommodate all different species depending on what they need. And that's one of the core things that we're pressing them for. Um, and So you should be seeing them accommodate that, whether that's through a pig who needs a mud wallow to do the things that a pig wants to do, to accommodating a prey species that wants places to hide, who doesn't want to be on exhibit for people to come look at because that is so stressful. Um, and I think there's something sort of inherent in that framework that has a very impactful meaning about the value of animal life, because we are not differentiating when I evaluate a farm sanctuary versus a wildlife sanctuary. I am lending equal um, consideration to a chicken versus an elephant in terms of making sure that they're provided what they need to be safe, to be healthy, to be happy to the extent possible. And I think there's something unsaid in that, where I spend a lot of time making sure that chickens have what makes chickens happy. Um, and they are no less than any other animal. And so sanctuaries have sort of this unspoken value ingrained in that I think is really important culturally.
You brought up chickens because I know, like, the effective altruism movement right now, it's for those who aren't aware of it, it's really looking at which animals do we exploit in the most massive numbers, and chickens are there. And for someone who hasn't met a chicken, you might not realize how intelligent they are because they're not portrayed that way. And I know that just at the sanctuary where I volunteer, it's like they all have names, they all have personalities. They have certain foods that they like more than others. They definitely have a social structure. Just in talking about the red flags or what separates a true sanctuary from one that's not. I know you mentioned, big red flags are pay to play is what we used to call it when I was in the animal protection field, right? Where it's like, for $50, you can take your picture with this nocturnal sloth who's out in the middle of the daylight. Like, doesn't need to be. Or, pay $150, you can go swimming with dolphins. Or, even something like you mentioned with farmed animals on our interest call, sometimes it's more difficult to tell because we're not clued in. But, if an animal doesn't want to interact with you, and they're forced to. Or something that I've seen with, you mentioned like a prey species who doesn't want to be like out in the open on display. Like when you said that, I thought instantly of these drive-through safaris that we see where there's no one there actually watching how you interact with the animals, but you can just drive through and feed them from these little paper cups with food that's not healthy for them. But we've definitely read reports from federal inspectors. This is not just made up stuff. This is like the federal organization that is meant to ensure their welfare, that a lot of these venues will sometimes starve the animals so that the animals want to go up to people's vehicles so that they get fed this unhealthy food. I know you mentioned too having enough space, but also having space to retreat. I think that's one of the biggest red flags when I'm vetting places where I'm looking and I'm like, okay, you say this baby otter gets to interact on his or her own terms, but then they're in this little tiny circular enclosure with an open top where people can just crowd around and like reach in their hands and pick up this poor animal. I know with like the wildlife too, there's some regulations for like no active breeding. Like if you're a sanctuary, you're not creating more animals because there are already, like you mentioned, all these animals from zoos that shut down or private ownership of animals that, people shouldn't even have. I think too, the baby animal situation is the one that should be a red flag to pretty much anyone. And I know with the Big Cat Public Safety Act passing this year, thankfully, you can no longer take selfies with like tiger cubs anymore. But like those are some that immediately stand out to me where I'm like, if you're paying to play with these animals, if they can't choose whether they interact with you or not, this is really not a place you should be going. Because I think a lot of times I see this happening with parents and their kids where it's like, well, my kid loves these animals and I just want them to have a good time. So like I'm going to take them to this place. Like I think sometimes it's easier for us to shut off our brains and just be like, no, everything's fine, even though your conscience is like, I don't think something's right here. But why as people do we have a responsibility to help these animals by not exploiting them by going to these places?
Sure. I mean, a lot of what you've said, and I'll backtrack a little bit,
Yeah.
encompasses some of these sort of true sanctuary tenets that we have. I think the overarching question here about why care about any of these ideas, as a parent myself, if I decide where I'm going to take my daughter as a person who cares deeply about animals, and what I want her to learn from that experience. Um, a broad concept is that it really should be animal centric and not human centric. Um, so a lot of that is couched in not objectifying animals, in having a very serious sense of respect for them and for their wishes. Because even some domestic and friendly animals sometimes don't want to interact, just like people. We have our days where we're just not in the mood. Um, and so instilling that societally in respect for those animals and for their wishes um, is a big deal. Not supporting places who don't, honor that, core concept is important because they thrive on profits from people visiting. So we really don't want to put our money into something that we don't agree with. But the way that this plays out, pay to play is a fantastic example, and it has different iterations depending on the species you're talking about. But as you mentioned, when it comes to wild animals, any time that you see a place offer direct contact with wildlife, you can go ahead and cross them off your list. You should never see anybody, member of the public, allowed access direct to wildlife for so many reasons, safety being one of them for both. Um, And, as you mentioned, um, we do not allow any breeding for captivity. A Sanctuaries pretty much of any uh, species group are at capacity or far beyond it already. There are far more animals in need of housing and help than there is space in sanctuary. And so we don't need to continue to breed animals for captivity. Ultimately, when it comes to wild animals, captivity in a true sanctuary is second only to a life in the wild. That's where they are meant to be. So we can try our best to accommodate them in a captive situation, but that's still not the ideal. So we shouldn't be placing any more, and we do not allow sanctuaries to breed. They as you mentioned too, there's a lot that goes into visitation and education and outreach programming. And I think to your point, these can send some really interesting messages to people about those animals. And there's certainly many people out there who make conservation claims or fostering like a care for animals claim. But we really need to be showing animals in a light that is fair to them and caring of them. And so true sanctuaries are really the model we need to be looking to. So if we have organizations who allow public access, they have to have guided educational tours. These are not for anybody's entertainment. This is not somewhere to just go for fun. It can be fun, but the prime purpose is not entertainment. It is education. And it's very carefully monitored when it comes to any kind of domestic species. As you mentioned, we still shouldn't be seeing animals that can't retreat or that the sanctuary has not set up in a way that we make sure animals who are stressed by visitors can't opt out of. Um, Baby, the iteration of pay to play for me for non-wildlife is often the petting zoo kind of model.
Please
And that's a
explain
big,
that. Please
yeah,
explain
big
that
point
because
of
it's
differentiation.
so prevalent, and people really don't think there's any harm in it. And is that true? Is it just petting a bunch of baby animals without mothers? Like, yes, please talk about that.
Sure. As of course, the farm space is my passion. So um, I'll often see, at the fairgrounds, you've got the baby goats, and as you mentioned, like the classic paper cups where you get to feed them, and you got to ask yourself some questions like, where is this constant stream of baby animals coming from? Um, why are they always available? Where is their mother? Is it safe for them to have all these people's hands on them when they're a little baby who's susceptible to getting sick, to being stressed? Um, what is an appropriate diet for them? Should they really be eating however much you want to feed them? We're asking sanctuaries to have individualized diet plans for residents, very different from, you know, put in your quarter and feed them as much as you want. And so oftentimes they're in very small enclosed areas where there is nowhere else for them to go. Um, and so those are all red flags. Um, and a lot of those animals end up in sanctuaries, in true sanctuaries, once they have outgrown or outlived their usefulness. So when there is an entertainment factor or profit at play, you can almost always be sure that the animal's needs and welfare will come second to what they can get out of that monetarily.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think that it's so, so important what you just said because it's across all species, right? Like it's easier to understand that if you're petting a tiger cub, like at some point that tiger cub's going to grow up and probably end up in a roadside zoo. And then when they're done, you know, they're not ever going to have a good life, but it is true of the farmed animals as well. It's just, how many people go to these places and say, what happens to this animal when he or she grows up? You know, do you keep them for your life? Do you slaughter them? You know, you don't see that on signs like this is our farm and this is the way that we slaughter our animals because people don't want to acknowledge that. But I think we do have that responsibility to ask, you know, if we're going to be supporting this, what kind of life are we creating? And I think what you said too about entertainment versus education, sometimes I think it's important to step back and realize that, you know, your 15-minute tour or your 30-minute or interaction that becomes a memory, you know, that's that animal's entire life. That the and I know I'm preaching to the choir here because I see you nodding your head, you know, but it's just like, you know, one of the things that I think keeps me going is just realizing that these animals are not here for our entertainment. They're not here to give us a fleeting sense of happiness when their entire life is full of misery. Something newly on my radar too, the more people I talk to across, not just in animal advocacy, but food safety, food security, whatever you want to go to. It's just I'm seeing that even as I think our society's starting to question our government more, there's also this relinquishing of individual responsibility where we want to believe if things were really that bad, our government wouldn't allow it. Right? If animals were really suffering this much, like these places wouldn't be licensed. If these places were keeping their animals in grimy situations and not feeding them enough and letting them go without veterinary care, like the federal inspectors would come in and they would shut them down. Um, and so I see a lot of reliance on like people who go to websites, if they even go that far, you know, and it's like, oh well, this place is licensed by the US Department of Agriculture, which is the federal organization that oversees animals and the enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act. Or for wildlife, this is, you know, licensed by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And people think that just because this place is still up, it's still running, it has these licenses. I think people think that because they have a license, there are these stringent regulations that have to happen, and that if you violate, then you lose your license. But can you talk a little bit about the reality of the situation?
Absolutely. And I agree with you that I do think that it's very misleading for people to feel that the Animal Welfare Act exists, but they don't understand how it plays out in terms of regulation. And so to your point, more broadly, um, you know, there's an interesting trend that I've observed where the amount of regulation sort of corresponds to how we value a species or group of species in our culture. So you could see differences from country to country, but in general, you know, we see far more protections for companion animals who we value very highly, at least in the United States, in some Western countries, um, followed up by wildlife organizations. I think people have um, respect and interest in protecting wild animals and are fascinated by them, rightly so. And then you start to see this sort of trickle down effect from, you know, okay, we've got slightly less value attributed to certain other species, and farmed animals, I can tell you with certainty, are absolutely unprotected. There is no federal legislation protecting farmed animals prior to their slaughter. So when it comes to sanctuaries, there's nothing. Um, and so you're really left with this vacuum where people can do as well or as badly as they want. And you are correct. You know, the USDA is the main federal body who may license oftentimes the wildlife sanctuaries. They have sort of different subsets. And I will tell you that even for wildlife, even for other kinds of animals, regulations are choppy at best. And the ones that exist, even a USDA license, for example, a Class C exhibitor's license, that's going to be for an organization or a facility that gives public access, they are checking the bare minimum of basic animal care, and some policies around human safety in relation to visiting those facilities. Um, I can tell you right now that the GFAS standards are leagues further above, more rigorous than a USDA license. There is no comparison. So if you're getting a USDA fine or violation, these are often on some really basic requirements that they should be meeting. But again, it doesn't cover everything, and the US Fish and Wildlife regulations are often state by state, species by species. And so you get this very choppy coverage where there's lots of loopholes and there's lots of ways that animals can fall through the cracks and be unprotected. And so that's part of where we come in, to fill in that gap, because even if you are USDA licensed, you've checked off a few of the most basic criteria, but there is no license out there that is nearly as comprehensive as what we are checking in terms of ethics, in terms of organizational stability, fundraising. I mean, there's so much that goes into it, even beyond animal care.
Yeah. And you have your work cut out for you, for you as a
Yes.
person, who does this. And, I know that one of the incredible tools that you have is that there's a search bar where you can put in your zip code and find one of these places near you so that, rather than taking your child to the zoo, you can go to an actual sanctuary where your presence there is going to help the organization that's really doing this compassionate work. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about the GFAS accreditation.
So it's worth noting that GFAS is the only global accrediting body for sanctuaries and rescue centers. There is nobody else. And we have a set of very rigorous standards, both for animal care and other nonprofit operational aspects. Again, this is super comprehensive. And so the way that this plays out is that we evaluate organizations that come to us and accredit or verify those who are meeting those standards. So there's these sort of two tiers that we're looking at. But as far as concepts around high quality animal care, safety, and some basic financial things, no matter who has our badge on their website, you know that we have spent a lot of time vetting them. And as you said, it's very hard and it's very time consuming to research and know who is a reputable, legitimate sanctuary and not. And you really cannot rely on social media or websites because people claim all kinds of things. And so it is incredibly difficult to know just from that. So the goal is that if you see a GFAS accredited badge on somebody's website, I have done all the legwork for you. As far as like what goes into that process, our sanctuaries themselves will tell you that it is really daunting and rigorous. And so if they have met those criteria, you can bet that they are the best of the best. On average, we're looking at things on paper for sure, formal documentation for safety procedures, animal care protocols, financial documents, insurance coverage. I mean, all kinds of things. I could probably bore you with some of the technical aspects, but I'm spending time reading all of them, tax documents, all of it. And it takes us an average of 48 hours of staff time to evaluate one sanctuary. And I know when I always say that number, it sounds like, oh, 2 days. No, but 48 hours of staff time means over a week of someone working full time, doing nothing but evaluating that one organization. Beyond that, we do in-person site visits to every sanctuary that we certify. Because again, it is hard to get a true picture just from paper. And so the most valuable aspect of our program is that we set foot at those sanctuaries. We spend time with the sanctuary operators. We see the residents. We see the infrastructure. We comb through records. So we spend time, depending on the sanctuary, I could be there for a few days. It just depends. About how extensive they are, but we are going to all of them and checking those things for you, which culminates in this accreditation, which, as you mentioned, Lex, you can, on our website, we have this it's called our Find a Sanctuary tool. And you can search by somewhere you're visiting anywhere around the world. You can search by type of animal that you want to visit. You can search for volunteer opportunities, adoption opportunities, all of those things. And again, we've done all the legwork in vetting those organizations so that people don't have to worry.
Yeah. And I think it's amazing too that just because they get accredited 1 year, it's not like they're accredited for life. Like
Correct.
there's renewal procedures, and it's not like the USDA where a license just automatically renews, like whether or not
No.
like, inspectors have been out there again. I just mentioned for people who might be like, but I love this animal sanctuary and they treat their animals so well, but I went to your search tool and they're not listed. Like, are they a bad sanctuary? Like, what are some reasons that maybe legitimate places are not yet listed?
Probably some very large subset that would meet the criteria and just aren't accredited yet. And we've done some recent research, so I hope everybody who listens or hears this will follow us, and we'll keep you posted. But we've had some very recent research in which we have created global censuses of animal sanctuaries, and so we are starting to get in some of those numbers as far as how many are there in the world. And so, for example, just farm sanctuaries alone, there's an estimated over 1,000 the world over, and the farm sanctuary movement is young. The
Yeah.
first charity, nonprofit, formalized farm sanctuary did not come into being until the 80s. And so, as a movement, it's still relatively young. And so, some folks, honestly, running a sanctuary, I have the utmost respect for sanctuary operators because I can tell you, having spent a lot of time at sanctuaries, that it is the most difficult work I have ever seen.
Mm.
It's physically taxing, it's emotionally taxing, it requires a lot of multitasking and is often underfunded. They just have challenge after challenge after challenge. And so, honestly, sometimes they just don't have bandwidth to go through the accreditation process. Um, we do our best to support groups as they move through and help them, but sometimes it's just that they aren't ready yet. And other folks just decide whether or not their particular stakeholders, their donors, their you know, the members of the public, whether or not they feel like they want to go through the process. So if you know of an excellent sanctuary that is not yet on our website, then send them to us. Because some of this is just, it will take time to get everybody there. And I think also this speaks to the cultural moment of wanting and valuing those high standards for animals in care. And so we'll keep we'll keep pushing that envelope.
I feel like there's so many licenses today where you pay $100 and you're in, right? Like,
Yeah.
not so much in this movement, but it's like you fill out some paperwork, it's not rigorous, and then you just put it on your resume or you put it on your website, and then people are like, ooh, you have this fancy shiny badge. But it's really cool that just with GFAS, it's like when you come in and you give these organizations this feedback, it's not to cut them down. Like from what I've heard, you want sanctuaries to succeed because when sanctuaries fail, animals get hurt, like where are these 300 animals going to go when everyone else is booked like to the limit? And so, yeah, in case anyone's listening and is like, well, I love this sanctuary and I'm afraid of you like coming in and giving them like a bunch of things to work on. In my experience, the sanctuary where I volunteer is GFAS accredited.
There.
They will tell you, this, I don't want to speak for them, but it's like, there's always things they can improve on. But, from the staff that I've talked to, they appreciate that because in their heart of hearts, they want to create the best life possible that they can for animals.
I always like to tell tell sanctuaries who are applying or who are thinking about it that GFAS accreditation is not pass fail.
Yeah.
And most of our sanctuaries who have gone through the process or are in the process will say, just by going through the application, I identified 5 different things I had never thought of before that I need to attend to, or I need to take care of, or I just never thought of it. And so if they have that mindset of being open to feedback, to keep elevating their work and doing the best for the animals, then they will get value from that audit process where I can help you identify what's going really well and what else you can do to keep improving. And as you said, the goal is support, because what we don't want to see happen is for sanctuaries to fail, because they fail often. And when they do, all of those animals that had been saved are now back in harm's way. We never want to see that. And so we spend a lot of time on building capacity and sustainability for organizations and risk management for organizations. A funny thing is that most of these people are animal lovers. And so a lot of times, not always, there's some really savvy business-minded folks out there, but a lot of people come into it because they love animals. And so it's hard to hear, but you've got to come at it from a nonprofit management and business mindset, because if those things aren't in place, your excellent animal care still will become impossible. So we've got to have both of those pieces. And I like to tell our sanctuaries that not to feel bad, because there is not a single sanctuary, no matter how big their budget is, no matter how veteran they are, no matter how long they've been doing this, that comes out of GFAS accreditation with no feedback. Every single one of them gets things that they can keep working on.
Yeah.
And as you said, to support them, not to cut them down. That's not what we're going for.
Yeah. And I know that must be so valuable, because just from working with farmed animals myself, it's just, I know even like the barn design, when they were looking for a barn design, the only barn designs that are out there are for like intensive animal agriculture that doesn't really like, they had to go overseas to find like a model in a different country that was like, yeah, you can put these brushes up for cows so they can rub up against it and that feels good to them. And so to have feedback from an organization that is putting the animal first, not the animals used to us, or the maximum way you can minimize space to get the most animals in there in horrible conditions and still pass minimum standards. If you could summarize just any main messages you want people to take away from GFAS's work.
I think what I'd really like people to remember is that sanctuaries are a really unique, valuable space. There is nothing like it anywhere else in the world, and certainly not in animal advocacy, because sanctuaries create a model for what our relationship with animals could look like if we aren't exploiting them, if we are respecting them, and if we are valuing them the way they ought to be valued. Um, and, you know, I think all of us in animal protection spend a lot of time being exposed to horrors, right? Whether that's factory farming or animals in laboratories, or, you know, animals who are pacing in tiny cages somewhere. We've seen all kinds of things. And so sanctuaries are the antidote to all of that. That's part of what landed me in this work, is that after years of being a student and witness to all of those horrors, I really needed a space where I could keep pushing for animals and what I wanted for them, in a way that helped me feel like there was some light at the end of the tunnel here. Like, what could this look like? So there's nowhere else to see that. So for anybody listening, if you've never visited a true sanctuary, I encourage you to pull up our Find a Sanctuary tool and go visit, because there is nothing like it. And if you're not in a position to go visit one, start by following them on social media. because my goodness, the videos they post of these animals, some are funny, some are cute, some are devastating, but you see this redemption arc for them, and you see them overcome trauma, and you see them model resilience. They've taught me so much. And so I want people to have that experience. And I think that if you do, um, you will value sanctuaries as much as I do, because sometimes they're sanctuaries for people too. Um, People who have seen whatever it is that has upset you or discouraged you. So when I need to get back to my motivation and my hope for the world, that's where I go. I go muck a barn on a Sunday and let the sheep jostle me for treats, and watch the goats shenanigans. I let a turkey sit in my lap and pet them, because some turkeys like that. They'll come sit in your lap like a cat and purr. And so don't do that with wild animals, but um, but being among them and seeing that is important, and I think it reminds us of what's possible. So if you're in a position to support them, please donate to them. They are always needing more support. If you're not in a position to donate, something as simple as sharing their videos on your social media is huge. It gets them in front of more people, and we want people seeing true sanctuaries because they are doing the work well. So I'll leave it at that, but I really think that there's nothing else in the world like them.
I really appreciated how Jessica explained some of the main guiding values of a true sanctuary, including putting the animals' welfare and comfort way before promotion or profit, creating spacious enclosures that meet species-specific needs, and ensuring that animals can choose whether to engage with visitors or not. I hope we are moving toward a time where loving animals also means making a conscious commitment not to contribute to their exploitation or suffering. It's amazing that there are so many incredibly hardworking and compassionate sanctuaries out there working to give animals their best lives. You can find links to the Find a Sanctuary tool and more information about the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking the time to travel with me today. May any words or wisdom that resonated stay with you and grow in the upcoming days. Till next time, stay wild and rooted in compassion.